Sweet sisters, I must confess something I've been wrestling with quietly for some time. It is this subtle, persistent tension between the longing to rest deeply and the relentless urge to move swiftly, almost immediately, into action. I have noticed, perhaps you have too, how often we rush headlong into obedience, into doing what we believe is right or necessary, without first pausing to nurture the wellspring within us. There is this hurriedness that pulses beneath our choices, a hurriedness that whispers, "Don't stop. Don't pause. Keep going." And yet, in that urgency, I find myself drained, restless, and often left wondering why the clarity I seek remains elusive. I wonder, what if the true beginning of obedience is not in the immediate doing, but rather in the sacred act of resting first? What if the call to obey is not just a summons to action, but an invitation to first receive, to pause, to breathe, to be restored? This thought has quietly taken root within me, like a seed planted in the fertile soil of my weary heart. It challenges the way I have long understood obedience, and invites me to reconsider the rhythms of my soul. There is a common tendency among us, especially in the circles of faith and service, to equate obedience with busyness. The more we do, the more devoted we seem. The faster we respond, the more faithful we appear. But I have come to see that this equation can be dangerously misleading. Obedience that flies from exhaustion and neglect of the self is fragile. It cracks under pressure and often leads to frustration, bitterness, or even burnout. I have seen this pattern play out not just in my own life, but among dear friends and companions on this journey. I notice a growing awareness stirring within me, a gentle but persistent call to pause, before the rush, before the next task, before the next yes. This call is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is as quiet as a whisper in a crowded room, or a stillness that settles beneath the noise of my thoughts. It beckons me to nurture myself, to gather my scattered pieces, and to enter into a space of restoration. It asks me to recognize that I am not merely a vessel to be emptied in service, but a beloved child of God who needs replenishment. Why does it feel so different for me, this invitation to rest first? I have wrestled with that question deeply. Is it a form of procrastination, I wondered? Or worse, could it be a subtle form of disobedience, a reluctance to step into the work that God has placed before me? These doubts have haunted quiet moments, especially when the expectations of others and the demands of ministry press heavily upon my shoulders. Yet, in my heart, a still, small voice urges me to listen differently, to trust that rest is not the enemy of obedience but its precursor. This inner tension between the impulse to act and the call to rest feels like standing at a crossroads. One path beckons with the familiar cadence of productivity, the tangible results of action, the applause of visible achievement. The other path, less traveled and sometimes obscured by fog, invites me into a sanctuary of stillness, where the rhythms of my soul can slow, where I can inhale grace deeply before exhaling it out into the world. I begin to notice that this tension is not unique to me. Perhaps it is woven into the fabric of our shared human experience, especially for those who carry the weight of responsibility and the desire to serve well. There is a collective hurry, a cultural pulse that prizes doing over being, speed over patience, quantity over quality. And yet, just beneath this surface, I sense a deeper longing, a yearning for rest that is not mere inactivity but a profound restoration of the heart and spirit. I ask myself, might it be that obedience is not a race to be won but a dance to be entered with grace? A dance that requires attunement to the music of God's timing, which often includes seasons of quiet and waiting. This thought shifts something within me. It softens the hard edges of performance-driven faith, and opens a space where I can lean into the sacred pause. There is a sacredness in rest that I am only beginning to understand. It is not a luxury or a concession. It is a vital practice of honoring the life God has given me. When I rush without rest, my vision blurs, my heart hardens, and my spirit grows weary. But when I embrace rest, even when it feels counterintuitive or uncomfortable, I find a surprising renewal. Clarity arrives not in doing more, but in surrendering to the stillness He provides. I want to gently encourage you to consider this sacred invitation. Rest first. Before you say yes to the next demand, before you plunge into the next task, before you offer your time and energy again, pause. Let this pause be a holy space where you listen deeply to the whispers of your soul and the gentle promptings of the Spirit. This is not a call to inactivity but a call to preparation, preparation of the heart, mind, and body for faithful response. In these moments of pause, I find myself drawn back to the quiet places where God's presence feels most tangible. Sometimes it is in the early morning light filtering through my window, other times in the simple act of breathing slowly and deeply. These small acts of rest become acts of worship, sacred rituals that realign me with the rhythm of grace. It is not always easy. The world around me keeps spinning with its demands and expectations. The voices urging me to hurry, to prove myself, to do more, are persistent. Yet I am learning to listen more closely to the still small voice that calls me back to the wellspring of life within. I am learning that I must rest before I obey. I do not have all the answers, and the struggle continues. But in this struggle, I find a quiet hope, a hope that rests not in my own strength but in the faithfulness of the one who invites me to the table of rest. The frustration hasn't disappeared completely, but it's softened, replaced by a quiet trust that resting first is not a detour from obedience, but a sacred path toward it. Sweet sisters, I share this with you not as one who has arrived, but as a fellow traveler on this winding road. May we walk together, gently reminding one another that true obedience begins in the heart that has been nurtured by rest. May we find courage to slow down, to listen, and to receive the restoration that prepares us to serve with joy and clarity. I wonder, will you join me in this sacred pause? Will you dare to trust that resting first is in itself an act of faithful obedience? The journey is unfolding, and I am learning that the invitation to rest is an invitation to come home. Home to the heart, home to the soul, and ultimately home to God's tender care. Sweet sisters, as I linger in this space of newfound awareness, a deeper struggle begins to surface within me, one that is both tender and troubling. I find myself grappling with impatience, that restless companion who whispers, "Why wait? Why pause now when there is so much to be done?" This impatience is not merely a fleeting emotion, but a persistent shadow casting doubt on the invitation to rest first. At times, I question whether this deliberate pause might be a form of procrastination cloaked in spiritual language, or worse, a subtle act of disobedience disguised as self-care. How do we discern the difference? When does rest become a sacred preparation, and when does it morph into avoidance? These questions have echoed in my heart during quiet moments, often accompanied by a gnawing unease that I might be shirking the very call God has placed on my life. I imagine many of you have felt this inner conflict as well, the tension between honoring our need for renewal and the pressure to prove our faithfulness through constant activity. In wrestling with these doubts, I have turned to the stories that have shaped my faith, seeking wisdom from the narratives where rest and restoration are woven into the tapestry of God's plan. The scriptures do not shy away from rest. Rather, they elevate it as a vital part of the journey. For instance, God's own example in creation reminds us that after the work of forming the world, He rested on the seventh day, blessing it and making it holy. This divine rhythm of work and rest is not incidental but intentional, a sacred pattern embedded in the fabric of life itself. I reflect on the story of Elijah, worn and weary from his flight and fight, who found refuge not in frantic activity, but in a quiet cave where he was nourished by the gentle whisper of God's presence. His restoration was not a reward for productivity, but a necessary preparation for the next phase of obedience. Similarly, the Israelites were commanded to observe the Sabbath, a day set apart not merely for physical rest but for spiritual renewal, a time to reconnect with God and recognize their identity as beloved children. These stories offer a counter-narrative to the culture's relentless push for more, faster, better. They invite us to consider rest not as a sign of weakness or delay, but as a sacred prerequisite for faithful living. Neglecting rest, I have come to see, is not a harmless oversight but a dangerous path that leads to burnout, diminished clarity, and a shallow form of obedience that lacks depth and joy. In my own journey, the consequences of disregarding rest have been painfully evident. I have noticed how exhaustion blurs my vision, making it harder to discern the gentle nudges of the Spirit. Weariness seeps into my prayers, turning them from vibrant conversations into mechanical recitations. My heart grows heavy, and the vibrant colors of faith fade into muted tones. This depletion does not serve anyone, not myself nor those I seek to love and serve. Acknowledging this has been humbling. It has required me to confront my own misconceptions about rest and obedience. Rest is not the absence of action but the fertile soil from which authentic obedience blooms. When I fail to rest, I risk offering to God a fragmented, hurried version of myself rather than the whole vibrant person He longs to receive. This reframing has begun to shift how I view the sacred invitation to rest. Rather than seeing it as idle inactivity or a pause waiting reluctantly to be broken, I now understand it as an active, intentional practice, a spiritual discipline that prepares and sustains me for the work to come. Rest becomes a form of deep listening, a way to attune my heart to God's voice and timing. It is in these moments of stillness that I rediscover the wellspring of strength and clarity that fuels faithful obedience. I am learning to recognize the subtle ways neglecting rest manifests, not just in physical tiredness but in emotional fragility, spiritual dryness, and a diminishing capacity to love well. These warning signs remind me that rest is not optional but essential. It is the foundation upon which resilient faith is built, the quiet root that nourishes the visible branches of service and action. Yet, embracing rest is no simple task. It requires a conscious decision to resist the cultural currents that equate worth with productivity and busyness. It calls for courage to say no to demands that pull me away from renewal and yes, to practices that nurture my soul. This is a daily struggle, an ongoing negotiation between competing voices within and without. In this struggle, I have discovered the importance of reframing rest as a holy preparation rather than a selfish indulgence. When I choose to rest, I am not turning away from obedience but leaning into it more deeply. I am honoring the truth that God's work in and through me is sustained not by my own relentless efforts, but by the rhythms of grace that include rest and renewal. Sweet sisters, I want to share with you this insight. Rest is a sacred act of faith. It is a trust-filled surrender to the belief that God's timing is perfect and that our obedience is enriched, not hindered by moments of pause. Rest is not the enemy of action but its gateway. When we rest well, we are better equipped to respond with clarity, compassion, and enduring strength. I invite you to reflect on your own patterns of busyness and rest. Do you find yourself caught in the cycle of hurried obedience, driven by external expectations or inner restlessness? Or can you imagine a different way? A rhythm that honors the need for restoration as foundational to faithful response? This is not an easy journey, but it is one marked by tenderness and truth. In the quiet spaces where I wrestle with these questions, I remind myself that I am not alone. Many have walked this path before me, and many walk it alongside me now. There is a communal wisdom in acknowledging the tension between doing and being, between hurry and stillness. Together we can encourage one another to embrace rest as a holy act that precedes and empowers obedience. As I continue to navigate this delicate balance, I hold on to the hope that rest will no longer be seen as a delay or a weakness, but as a vital step in the dance of faith. May we learn to welcome rest with open hearts, recognizing it as the necessary preparation for the faithful work God calls us to. And may we find peace in the truth that in resting, we are already obeying the gentle, loving call of our Creator. The invitation remains before us. Will we accept it? Will we dare to trust that resting first is indeed an essential part of walking faithfully in the way of love? The journey is slow and sometimes uncertain, but it is one that leads us deeper into the heart of God and into the fullness of life He desires for us. Sweet sisters, the journey through this inner tension has ushered me into a new landscape, a place where insight begins to blossom, softening the harsh edges of my previous struggles. I have come to see with a growing clarity that rest is far more than a reprieve from weariness. It is foundational to restoration, and restoration is essential for sustainable obedience. This realization has shifted the way I understand not only my own path, but perhaps the path of all who seek to follow with wholehearted devotion. There is a sacred rhythm woven into the very fabric of creation, a rhythm that honors times of labor and seasons of stillness. God's design includes rest as a vital season, not an afterthought or a mere pause between tasks. This truth resonates deeply within me now, revealing rest as an active, intentional engagement with God's timing, a quiet surrender to the flow of grace that renews and empowers. I am learning that God's timing is often countercultural. While the world races ahead, chasing immediate results and constant productivity, God invites us into seasons of quiet and renewal. These seasons may feel slow, even frustrating, but they are rich with purpose. They are the fertile soil from which vibrant, faithful obedience grows. When I lean into these rhythms, I discover that rest is not emptiness but fullness. A fullness that restores my soul and equips me to respond with clarity and joy. In this light, resting becomes a spiritual discipline, a sacred practice that honors God's design for human flourishing. It is not passive or weak but deeply active, a deliberate choice to cease striving and to receive the nourishment that only God can provide. In these moments I find myself drawn into the presence of the One who sustains me, who breathes life into my tired bones and renews my weary spirit. This act of resting invites me to welcome stillness as a sacred space, a holy ground where I can listen more attentively to God's voice. It becomes a sanctuary amid the noise and demands of life, a place where distractions fall away and the heart can focus on what truly matters. Here in the quiet, I find the courage to release control and trust that God's plans unfold in perfect timing. Even when I cannot see the path ahead clearly, I have come to understand that true clarity arrives not in doing more, but in surrendering to the stillness He provides. It is in these pauses that the fog of confusion lifts, and the path forward emerges with gentle certainty. The restless urge to act without pause softens, replaced by a quiet trust. A trust that resting first is not a delay but a preparation for faithful response. This transformation within me is not instantaneous but gradual, a slow unfolding of insight and grace. The frustration that once pressed heavily on my chest has softened. It has not vanished entirely, but it no longer dictates my choices or steals my peace. Instead, it has been replaced by an openness to God's timing and a willingness to embrace the sacred pauses as integral to the journey. I realize now that rest and obedience are not opposing forces but companions on the path of faith. They dance together in harmony, each enriching the other. Rest replenishes the spirit, enabling obedience to flow from a wellspring of vitality, rather than from the last reserves of strength. Obedience, in turn, becomes a joyful response to the life-giving rest that sustains it. This understanding invites me to view my own weariness and spiritual dryness, not as failures but as signals, gentle nudges that beckon me back to the well of restoration. It challenges the notion that I must push through exhaustion to prove my faithfulness. Instead, it encourages me to pause, to listen, and to receive the renewal that God offers freely. In embracing this perspective, I have discovered a new kind of freedom. I am no longer bound by the relentless pressure to perform or to earn God's favor through endless activity. I am invited instead into a rhythm of grace, where rest is a sacred gift and obedience flows naturally from a heart renewed. Sweet sisters, this insight is a tender invitation to you as well. May we together learn to honor the seasons of rest as essential to our journey of faith. May we cultivate the courage to slow down, to embrace stillness, and to receive the restoration that prepares us to walk faithfully in the path God has set before us. Let us remember that resting is not a retreat from obedience but a deepening of it. It is a sacred act that aligns us with the rhythms of creation and the heartbeat of our Creator. In this alignment we find strength, clarity, and a renewed capacity to love and serve. I want to encourage you to welcome these seasons of quiet renewal with open arms, trusting that they are not interruptions but integral parts of your spiritual journey. May you find peace in the stillness and courage in the waiting, knowing that God is at work within you, preparing you for the faithful steps ahead. As I continue to walk this path, I hold on to the hope that rest will be embraced not as a burden or a hindrance, but as a vital life-giving rhythm. May this hope nourish your soul as it does mine, drawing us deeper into the grace and presence of the One who calls us to rest before we obey. Sweet sisters, as this gentle awakening to the necessity of rest takes deeper root within me, I find myself stepping into practical ways to honor this sacred rhythm. It is one thing to understand rest as spiritual nourishment. It is another to live it out intentionally amid the demands of daily life. This transition from insight to practice has been both challenging and life-giving, a pilgrimage marked by small, deliberate steps toward embracing rest as a vital part of my obedience. I have begun to prioritize rest through intentional practices that invite me to slow down and receive God's restoration. Sabbath keeping, once a distant ideal, has become a cherished rhythm, a holy pause in the midst of busyness. On these days, I resist the temptation to fill every moment with activity. Instead, I embrace stillness, allowing space for quiet prayer, gentle reflection, and simple pleasures that soothe my soul. These sacred pauses are not just breaks from work but vital moments of communion with the divine, where my spirit is refreshed. Prayer pauses, too, have become a lifeline. Rather than rushing through hurried prayers or ticking off spiritual checklists, I am learning to linger in God's presence, offering moments of silence and listening. These pauses create sacred pockets of rest throughout the day, reminding me that obedience is not measured by the quantity of tasks completed, but by the quality of my connection with God. Self-care rituals, once neglected or dismissed as indulgent, have found their rightful place in my life. Whether it is a slow cup of tea in the morning, a walk in the fresh air, or a few minutes spent journaling my thoughts and prayers, these acts nurture my body and soul. They remind me that I am a beloved creation, worthy of care and tenderness. This recognition, though simple, has profound implications for how I approach obedience. Not as a burden to bear, but as a joyful response to the love I have received. As I weave these practices into my daily rhythm, I am starting to notice subtle but meaningful changes. Emotionally, I feel more grounded, less swayed by the whirlwind of demands and expectations. Spiritually, there is a renewed sense of intimacy with God, a deepening trust that sustains me even in moments of uncertainty. Physically, I experience greater vitality, as though my depleted reserves are being gently refilled. These changes ripple outward, touching the way I engage with the world and the people around me. Obedience becomes less about frantic activity and more about focused, joyful presence. I find myself able to respond with greater compassion and clarity, not because I am stronger on my own, but because I am drawing from a wellspring of rest and restoration that God provides. Yet, this journey is not without its challenges. The cultural currents that prize hustle and productivity are powerful and persistent. There are days when the pressure to do more and move faster threatens to sweep me away from these rhythms of rest. The voices of expectation, both external and internal, can be loud and convincing, tempting me to abandon the sacred pauses for the sake of immediate results. In these moments, I remind myself that true freedom lies not in yielding to these pressures, but in resisting them with the strength afforded by rest. I am learning to set boundaries gently but firmly, to say no when necessary, and to protect the sacred spaces where restoration happens. This requires courage and patience, as well as the grace to offer myself compassion when I falter. Sweet sisters, I want to encourage you from this place of ongoing transformation. If you find yourself weary or overwhelmed, consider what it might mean to prioritize rest intentionally. What small practices could you adopt that would create space for restoration in your life? Perhaps it is a weekly Sabbath, a daily prayer pause, or a simple self-care ritual that reminds you of your worth and belovedness. Know that these steps, though they may seem small or even insignificant, are acts of profound obedience. They honor the truth that we are made for more than endless doing. We are made for rhythms of rest and renewal that prepare us to serve with joy and faithfulness. Embracing rest is not a withdrawal from responsibility, but a deepening of our capacity to live into it fully. I am walking this path alongside you, learning and growing in the grace that sustains us. Together, may we find freedom in aligning with God's rhythm, discovering that the invitation to rest is also an invitation to abundant life. In this sacred dance of rest and obedience, may we be renewed and empowered to walk faithfully forward, step by step. Sweet sisters, as I reflect on this journey we have traveled together, the winding path from restless doing to sacred resting, I am filled with a quiet celebration of the transformation that unfolds when we embrace rest and restoration as prerequisites to obedience. It is not a simple or instant change, but a gradual awakening that breathes new vitality and purpose into our steps. I see now how the harmony found when rest and obedience coexist is a profound gift. They are not opposing forces but companions that enrich and sustain one another. Rest replenishes the well of our spirit, fills the empty places, and renews the strength that obedience requires. Obedience, in turn, becomes a joyful outpouring of the life that rest has nurtured, a dance of faith and grace that flows naturally and freely. This truth has reshaped the way I view my own faith and service. I no longer chase after activity as a measure of devotion, nor do I equate rest with failure or delay. Instead, I have learned to recognize rest as a faithful act, a courageous surrender to God's timing that prepares me for the work He calls me to do. It is in this sacred balance that I find peace, a peace that steadies my heart amid uncertainty and invites me to trust more deeply. I want to gently invite you, dear sisters, to reconsider your own pace. In the rush of our daily lives, it can be tempting to believe that speed and constant doing are marks of faithfulness. But what if true obedience is found in the rhythm of resting first? What if the courage to pause, to listen, and to be restored is the very heart of walking faithfully with God? This invitation is not easy to accept. It asks us to resist the cultural currents that prize busyness, and to choose instead a path marked by stillness and trust. It requires vulnerability to admit when we are weary, and humility to receive care and restoration without guilt. Yet I believe with all my heart that this path leads to a fuller, richer life, one marked by resilience, clarity, and wholehearted obedience. As we embrace this sacred rhythm, we discover that resting first is not a detour from our calling, but the very foundation upon which our faithful journey is built. It is the soil in which our obedience takes root and grows strong. In this resting we find the courage to say yes to God's call with hearts that are open, spirits that are renewed, and hands that are ready to serve. Sweet sisters, I celebrate with you the hope that this journey unfolds not in isolation but in community. We walk together, encouraging one another to embrace rest as a vital part of our shared faith. May we hold space for one another's weariness and victories, offering grace and support as we learn to live in the balance of rest and action. Let us step forward with gentle confidence, trusting that the one who invites us to rest also empowers us to obey. May we cultivate lives marked by peace, resilience, and a deep joy that comes from walking faithfully in God's presence. The journey continues, and with each step, may we be reminded that resting first is, indeed, an act of faithful, courageous obedience. If you love the story, like the video and subscribe.